The Digital Personal Data Protection Bill has been granted assent by the President Draupadi Murmu, making it into law. The permission was granted by the President on August 11th and it was notified in the Gazette the same day. India, which is one of the largest data markets in the world, will finally get its privacy law with the President's assent. The government is now likely to move on to framing and rolling out the rules and regulations of the DPDP bill. Minister for Electronics and IT Ashwini Vaishnaw announced on Twitter that the DPDP bill becomes an act and confirmed the President's assent. However, following the announcement of the bill, the Editors Guild of India expressed concerns over certain provisions of the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill and Press and Registration of Periodicals Bill. In a statement, the Guild said the DPDP bill creates an enabling framework for surveillance of citizens, including journalists and their sources. The PRB bill vests the government with powers to do intrusive and arbitrary checks into the functioning of newspapers and magazines, it said. It has also written about its concerns on the bills to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla, Rajya Sabha Chairman Jagdeep Dhankar, IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw and INB Minister Anurag Thakur, as well as leaders of political parties in the Parliament. The government tabled the DPDP bill in Lok Sabha on August 3rd with an aim to protect the privacy of Indian citizens, while proposing a penalty of up to Rs 250 crore on entities for misusing or failing to protect digital data of individuals. And now to talk a little more on the DPDP bill, or the Personal Data Protection Bill. We have with us our Associate Editor Al Muli, and we'll be speaking more and about this alarming letter written by the Editors Guild of India, raising concerns over the new bill. We'll also speak on that, but initially we'll just talk about the major takeaways of the bill. All right, sir, thank you so much for joining me on this special newsroom, sir. We are talking today, we'll be discussing about the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill, which was passed in the monsoon session, and now it's been given assent by the President on the 11th, and now that bill has now become an act. So what are some of the major takeaways of the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill, sir?
You're right, it was no surprise that the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill was introduced, because this was being expected for more than 3 years now. And I think during the height of the CAA protests in India, especially in Delhi, just right before the pandemic broke through, I think the government at the center was already planning this data protection bill. Now, the problem was that during the time it was released, the bill was introduced, there was a lot of protests and violence going on in Northeast Delhi, Bangalore, Karnataka, and even in the Northeast there were a lot of protests. So somehow the media glare was away from the bill that was introduced. But then fortunately and unfortunately the government could not introduce it, but now it's in 2023. It was very convenient for the government to introduce a bill which I believe that the media fraternity in India feels is a violation of the parameters of their actions, the parameters of your publication rights, and the extent the press can exercise its freedom in the dissemination of information and news reports. So anyhow, I think the primary and the heart of this particular bill is that the government will give more control over the personal data of individuals who use, for instance, the social media platforms, the internet institutions. So the government is trying to have to give the citizens greater control over their data, their personal details. And of course, when we talk of personal details, we are also talking about the financial aspects of a person when he is using the internet to transact business, for instance. So through this bill, this is the heart of the bill, to the act. The government wants to give more control to the citizens over their personal data. The problem here is the whole act talks about how there will be consent officers, there will be institutions that will be set up by the authorities to regulate the individual's data in this regard, how the establishment will also create enforcement mechanisms for them to able to regulate the personal details of individuals who use the internet. There will be a lot of changes that will give a lot of rights to the individual to control how their data is used, how their personal details are used over the internet. But what it does not say is that it is going to also give greater control over the government to, how do you put it, as some media people put it, spy on the media establishments, the newspapers and the magazines. So while on the other hand it is offering the citizen more control over his personal details and data in his use of the internet, on the other hand the government also is empowering itself with this act to have surveillance powers on the individual's data. So it's quite ironic, because on the other hand the citizen is assured that his personal details are safe. He has more control now, whether he can give his name or his birth or his village or the location of or his location and his educational details. On the other hand, it is the government who is handling the details of the individual here. So that is the reason why the media establishment in India is protesting, and they want the government of India to review this act, because specifically on the other hand there is the question of privacy, but on the other hand there is the question of surveillance from the government, because all the data will be handled not by the internet or the online institutions, but it will be handled, regulated and enforced by the government itself. Akivek.
All right, sir. Now coming to the other aspect of this particular newsroom, sir. The Editors Guild of India, which is an organization that was formed in 1978, has been spearheading the whole principle that press should have freedom. But now this institution called the Editors Guild of India has raised concerns over a series of matters regarding this personal act and how it could change the way journalism works. Also, sir, now the other thing spectacular about this bill would be when Ashwini Vaishnaw, in the words of Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw, he said, "I wish the opposition was there in the house to discuss on the bill." But unfortunately, the opposition members in the monsoon session walked out because of the Manipur issue. But disregarding all that, sir, there used to be a point of time in our lives when bills were being introduced into the house, there was always public discourse over it, or rather when it was still a bill, people used to have the opportunity to discuss amongst themselves. I mean, individual perceptions have nothing to do with the legislation of the bill, but at least there was an opportunity with the way we could discuss about certain legislations or bills that could become law and then ultimately affect us. But sir, are you also noticing the fact that nowadays bills are just being passed at a jiffy, and then there's hardly any time for discussion, there's hardly any time for public discourse, which is also one of the features that the Editors Guild of India raised up, saying that the bill was introduced in a very undemocratic way. So what do you have to say about that, sir?
Actually, it's very interesting, because before the BJP came to power way back in 2014, there was the media, especially the editorial organizations that have been spearheading the idea of press freedom and democracy in the working of the media establishment. There have been talks that there were some people who actually say that if the BJP comes to power, there will be a time when there wouldn't be any consultation on bills before they are passed, before you know it. So the idea was suggestive of a police state being formed in India, KV. And I think that is precisely, I wouldn't call it so, but it looks like that. Because I think if it quacks like a duck, if it looks like a duck, it is definitely a duck. So I think the Editors Guild of India was not really being too sensitive when they say that there should have been consultation with the stakeholders, that is the public and the media establishments, the newspapers and the magazines, especially the print industry, print news industry in India. There should have been consultations. The government should have given out at least some of the salient features of the act that it proposes to formulate, and only after it receives the opinions and have gathered discussion points in this regard, they should have gone ahead with the act, because that is the proper way, especially in a democratic country. Or so-called democratic country like India, there should have been the process. And even the state government in the recent times, even in the Northeast, they have done that similarly. Now, the interesting thing is here is that this particular Digital Personal Data Protection Act was not sent to a parliamentary standing committee. It should have gone to a review. It should have gone to a select committee first before it is brought for discussions. And I think the idea of trying to make the opposition parties, the demons in this whole conversation is a bit too immature here in this regard, because whether or not you are supposed to have a discussion in the parliament over certain issues, if there are important bills to be formulated and tabled and passed, I think it merits a discussion, whether it's in the session itself or calling itself a special session just for that particular bills to be passed. So I think the editors in India are quite unhappy that it was passed without discussions, because it should have gone to the media first, it should have gone to the stakeholder organizations, and the expert voices should have been taken into account before this particular bill was turned into an act.
All right, sir. Now, talking about the journalistic aspect and how it could be affected. Now, bringing back a little bit about the timeline, it was in 2018 that the Justice Sri Krishna Committee was actually looking over this data bill.
Right.
And in its recommendation report, it had stated specifically, if journalists were made to adhere to the grounds of processing personal data, it would be extremely onerous for them to access information.
Right.
And that mandating grounds of processing like consent would mean that accounts that are unfavorable to the data principle would simply not get published. So, which means Justice Krishna's report was actually stating that the bill should maintain some kind of balance between press freedom and also privacy. But now the Editors Guild of India has pointed out that this new bill would change the discourse of how journalists work in this country. So, could you shed a little light on how it will actually affect journalists?
I think it is a very simple context that we can utilize to explain why the media establishment in India is worried. First thing, when the government says personal details, what do you mean by personal details? Do you mean your educational qualifications, or do you mean the network of your relationships, the people that you are talking to, the family members that family members in your family who might be engaged in political activities? What information are you talking about? What personal data are you talking about? So the Act does not clarify in this regard. So in the context of press freedom, we will have to, the government will have to come up with a definition in regard to the personal information of individuals. If you post something in your name as a citizen and not as a journalist, and that particular post happens to be in opposition to the stance or the projects or the schemes or the statements of the ruling government, then how do you define that? Are you going to use that particular information as a citizen or as a journalist? If you are speaking as a journalist, then it means your statement is official. So the government is going to come against you in that regard. So you don't know whether you are speaking as a private citizen or a journalist in this regard. And second point, what the Act says is that the government controls your sources, the sources of your information. So if you are going to engage with a source for a news story that you are doing on, let's say on Facebook, you have not talked to each other, but you're connecting on Facebook, and you write a story based on that to the information that has been given to you on Twitter or Facebook, then the government will come at you saying, we need the information of this particular person that you interacted on Facebook for the story that you wrote about us. So now the law does not really define what kind of information is supposed to come under prosecution and what is allowed. So there is a lot of ambiguity in it. On the other hand, it is saying it is to protect your details, your personal details, your information. It gives you more control of your privacy. But on the other hand, the government can use this Act to actually disclose, for example, your sources. And once your source is disclosed, That is where the government is infringing on your right and on the freedom of speech, free speech of the media here, because you are not supposed to, under any circumstances, reveal the identity or details or about even your interaction with a particular person to anyone else. And in the media, you are a journalist, I'm a journalist, we know that we don't talk about the people who give us information,
Yes.
We don't talk about your sources. If Adonwa goes out reporting and he gets a story, he's not going to reveal his source to us, and we understand that. And I'm not going to reveal my source to him. That is the freedom and the right that we have as media persons. But this particular act takes that right away, because the government is going to define which story is against, let's say, the government, or which is for the government. If it is not pleased with any kind of information that you publish or telecast or broadcast or write it on the internet, then it's going to come against you. We don't know the difference between what is public interest stories and what is not. So the definition of personal data and information is defined only by the whims of the government, and God forbid we come to have a police government. If we come to have a police government like in China, then we all are in trouble, Akivi.
All right, so another aspect of the Editors Guild and its raising concern was that now, okay, fine, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act has been given the President's assent, and now this has now become a law.
Right.
Now this act talks about setting up of a data protection board.
Right.
Now the same committee of the Justice Sri Krishna committee had also recommended that the board should be free from the executive.
Right.
Now the Indian Constitution has properly defined what the judiciary has to do, what the executive has to do, and what the legislative powers have to do. And their roles have been properly defined and demarcated. Whereas now, the board that is now supposed to control the world's largest data market is now going to be appointed by the government to actually regulate the new laws and to see that the laws are being executed.
Right.
So how much of an independency can the board actually work on without getting interrupted all the time by the governments?
There is the idea of independence and autonomous functioning of this particular board or any committee that is associated with this particular act is no more, Akivi. Because the very act itself says that it's going to take away the autonomy of all the, for example, the media establishments, and even the collation of the personal details and information regarding the citizens are all controlled by the government. So even if you set up a board, there is no way it's going to be autonomous, because unless the government sets up members of the board who are from both the opposition, let's say the opposition benches and the ruling bench, then I think there might be a chance that there will be a likely convincing level of autonomy in that regard if there are other members who are not always from the ruling party, Akivi. But I think it is very clear that the government itself will be nominating members to this board. It will only mean that it is going to fill that particular committee or the board with only its supporters, its members, its MLAs. So I do not believe that there will be any kind of autonomy in this. The only kind of autonomy it can enjoy is if the government will not nominate the members here. But if the let's say the community organizations or if the media establishments and organizations in India get to nominate their members, then I think there will be a higher chance that there will be an autonomy in the exercise of the functions and the powers that have been listed in the act itself, Akivi. Otherwise, let's not talk about autonomy in this, because we have already read the legislation and now it is no more a bill but a law. We have no options but to go with what the government is saying. Of course, in special states, we can always shoot it down with a resolution. There are some states who can do that. But right now, as the way the board will be functioning and the way the legislation has been passed, there's no way we can talk about autonomy at this point unless the government comes up with a very different kind of a system where the members of the board itself are not from the ruling government. That is 100% that I can guarantee you, Akivi.
So basically what it entails is that if you look back in at least India's press history, let's take 20 years back, sir, I mean, or 20 or 25 years, the revelation of the 2G scam, the revelation
Right.
of the Bofors case, the revelation of so many corruption scams and scandals were actually revealed by journalists out of public interest stories, and which stories actually matter to the public.
Right,
So,
right.
so now, according to the Editors Guild and according to the DPDP Act of 2023, the government now has the option of deciphering if that is a public interest story too. So, how dangerous is that for revelation of any stories which are of public interest?
Very dangerous, Akivi. I mean, you cannot try to wash the severity of this issue here with some kind of a democratic sounding statement here. It is very dangerous because look at the RTI, for instance. In Nagaland, I think there was a report earlier about 3 or 4 years ago where there were reports that village councils were actually witch hunting RTI applicants who had sought information from the government using the Right to Information Act, Akive.
Yes.
And now we have a bigger monster and a bigger demon here in the form of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And this has more powers, more sweeping authority than the RTI can give to the citizen's right in his need for information. So it is not just dangerous, because when we are talking about the act deciding what is an invasion of someone's privacy or what constitutes a public interest story, we are going to define this kind of information based on the perspective of the ruling government, Akive. So if the Congress comes to power tomorrow at the center, they are going to define, let's say, a certain story which is not to their liking as anti-national. It could be anti-national, it could be anti-democracy. They're going to define it any way they want if the Congress comes to power. And the same way the BJP-led government or any other party that comes to power will be using this particular act to define only certain aspects of information that fits and promotes their ideology, their perspectives, and the way they want the society to have a take on what their mission is as a government. So it is going to be based on what you think is right. It's not going to be based on what is right as defined by the Constitution itself, what is fair and what is truthful. It will be defined only by what you think is right to you and whether it affects you directly or not. Akive, as simple as that.
All right, so thank you so much and for explaining to us and the viewers too in
Thank you, Akive,
simplicity
for having
about
me.
what dangers this law could have, especially for journalists. Thank you so much. Well, that was our associate editor Almuli, and you just heard him say how this new act, even though it's historic in nature, could actually affect normal working journalists who work for the public and also who want to reveal the truth. Ravish Kumar, in an interview with Al Jazeera, had said that Indian media has now become an establishment where it serves two owners, the real owner and the political owner. So I hope that this Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023 would not serve its two masters, the real master and the political master. Next week, we will be speaking more on how this particular bill affects us as individuals too. So stay tuned for that. But that's all we have for this conversation. Goodbye.